ciel bleu vole en silence les cœurs des gens amoureux. Hey everyone, so for today's video I am so excited because I am finally talking about my favorite wet looking eyeshadows. This video was originally done by Mariah Leonard, so I will leave her video link down below. Absolutely love her channel. I'm sure a lot of you guys already know who she is and follow her content, but for today's video, I'm going to share with you all my favorites. The term wet is very subjective, and I always like to kind of think of it this way. If you look at your favorite like red lipstick and then you compare it to another one, you'll start to notice those nuances. So you might say, is this really a red or is this more berry? Is this really red or is it more orange? So the same thing goes for the look and appearance of a eyeshadow. Like you could think it's super, super wet looking, and then you compare it to something else and you're like, is that really as wet as I thought? This is subjective, and you know, most of makeup is. So for me, there are three different components that I look for in a wet looking eyeshadow. There is, of course, reflection, there is texture and smoothness, and then there is contrast. Surprisingly enough, contrast I think actually makes quite a big difference in achieving that wet look. By the way, I will be saying wet almost every 5 seconds in this video. But let's very quickly touch on reflection and smoothness because these two things really go together. So in classical physics, I know this seems random, but I do think it's helpful. There are two different kinds of reflection. There's specular reflection and then there is diffuse reflection. Specular reflection is what happens, like for example, on a really, really calm lake. When you look into the lake, you can see the trees and the sky, and it gives you that mirror-like reflection. And that is caused not just from the light, but from the actual smoothness and the calmness of the water. That is the kind of reflection that I want to get as close as possible to in my wet looking eyeshadow. So it's not actually just about the sparkle, it is about the texture that the sparkles are integrated into. It needs to be incredibly smooth to be able to achieve that mirror-like wet effect. The other kind of reflection is diffuse reflection. Really, most of the things in the world are illuminated by this because nothing is that perfectly smooth. So again, all this is just to say that smoothness is way more important in a wet looking eyeshadow than I think most people realize, because also you will see in some of the pics that I have, the ones that really give you that super wet look aren't always the ones with the most reflective sparkle. Formula is really, really key here. And then the third aspect is also contrast. You need contrast in order to really give you that wet look effect. For example, in the swatches above, they're pretty similar, right? All of these eyeshadows are similar, but which one looks a little bit more wet? For me, it's the one with the slightly deeper base pigment. It's subtle, but it does actually have an effect to the overall effect. I really wanted to briefly touch on these things because I also want you all to be able to have kind of a framework to go off of when you're trying to find your own favorite wet looking eyeshadows. All right, but let's first start off with what is on my eyes today. This makeup brand, I think, really comes out with some absolutely stunning wet looking eyeshadows, and it is Pat McGrath. Today I have this shade on from the Divine Rose palette. It is, again, one of the glitter toppers. A dimensional shift within a glitter will help you get a little bit more of that wet look. All of this is to say that if you really enjoy playing with texture, light, and you want that wet looking sparkle on your eyes, these two palettes, both the Huetopian Dream palette as well as the Divine Rose palette, have been able to give me that pretty readily. And I really love that Pat McGrath palettes really set you up for success. Like, I feel like it makes artistry really fun for everyone because the colors are so expertly put together, because the textures are just so easy to work with. I just find that I'm always in love with the looks that I create. For today's look, I put Oyster Pearl from Charlotte Tilbury on my eyes as a base. That's another absolutely absolute favorite cream eyeshadow, period. And then I just tapped on the topper. Another shadow that I wanted to mention is this one in the Slight Flex palette from Revlon. I wanted to mention this one because I do think that the tones in here are similar to Pat McGrath. Obviously, this is not a similar formula, but this shade right up here on the top absolutely gives you that beautiful wet effect when you apply it on the lids. And it's partially because there is a little bit of that translucent look to it that makes for a more realistic kind of wet look, because again, obviously water is translucent. So to be able to kind of get that effect, I have noticed that within a formula, a little bit of translucence has been a factor in some of these formulas. This one is also really gorgeous because it has a very smooth baked formula in combination with that bit of translucence, and the shift of this product is what ends up getting you that wet look. It does have a touch of like a soft blue reflect that I think just is so gorgeous. Really affordable, gorgeous colors. I actually think all of the formulas within here are beautiful. Palette I've talked about before that I still absolutely love. Another palette pick for you all is from Roen, and this is the 1111 palette. So this is still my favorite. That's why I'm talking about this one in specific. Every shade in here gives me a really wet effect, and that's not always the case with all of the palettes that I've tried from Roen. So you would think that this topper shade, which you can apply and get that really high shine, reflective, textured look, like you would think that that would be able to give you the most wet look. But I've personally found that not the topper formula is what gives me that really creamy wet look. It's these creamy shades. It's just the perfect kind of model off duty eyeshadow quad because the textures are so beautifully creamy, easy to blend, and just have a very natural reflection to them that isn't necessarily dependent on the sparkle. It makes them just look so natural on the eyes and just really easy for every day. Texture really plays a key part in what makes this look wet on the eyes. And also I think it's important to note about a palette like this isn't going to be the most long wear eyeshadow palette, but I happen to find that it adds to the look. Like it gives you a little bit more of that undone, naturally radiant kind of eye look. So I quite love it. Next, let's talk about an eyeshadow product that honestly, it has been going in and out of stock pretty sporadically, but I will try and leave it linked down below because I believe it is in stock right now. This is the KVD Dazzle Stick. I personally have the shade Flash Storm. I actually was able to swatch these all out in person, and this is the shade that I thought gave me the most gorgeous wet effect. If you are looking for a long wear cream shadow that also will emit that beautiful wet reflection, this is the one that I would recommend pretty readily. This is so beautiful. So it's more of a taupey kind of cream eyeshadow, but it has the most beautiful, well done sparkle to it. It's not an overwhelming duochrome. For me, the colored sparkle actually just gives it that level of dimension. So, you know, for every day, I don't want a super heavy shift to my eyeshadows. I still absolutely love that look, but for more of an everyday look, I tend to gravitate towards like a very subtle kind of shift. The product itself is quite pigmented. You don't need a lot of this. I love that you can blend this out into the crease and it's not going to immediately crease on you. But more than anything, I think when you kind of sheer it out, it's still going to give you that reflectiveness. You don't need to really build it up. And again, it has that little bit of something, that little bit of translucence to the pigment when it's blended out onto the lids that gives me that wet look. That really is that extra X factor to this cream shadow. It's what ends up making it look a little bit more wet rather than just metallic. And I do think it's worth mentioning within all of these different formulas, I can only attest to the shade that I'm talking about within a range, not the entire range of makeup itself, unless I've tried it, obviously. So for example, with the Dazzle Sticks, there are certainly some shades within the line that I do think aren't as wet looking as this one is. All right, and now for one of my favorite eyeshadows ever. Not even just wet looking eyeshadows like cream shadows, really eyeshadow in general. It is Chanel New Moon. When I really think about the essence of creating a wet look eyeshadow, I think of this because I think it's just so perfectly done, perfectly executed. It twinkles and gives that beautiful, glossy looking effect every single time. And it not only produces a wet look on the lids themselves, it also has perfectly dialed in a color that I just haven't been able to find in another product. This color is so perfect. It's just so unique. It's beautiful for like a soft taupey purple kind of eye look, but the glitters are just fine enough and refined enough to be perfect for every day. The texture is absolutely perfectly smooth, and I do think that this texture is pretty unique. It's, I think, something between the Scattered Lights from Hourglass and the Bodiography glitter pigments. This to me is more refined than both of those products and give you an even more wet look than either of those can. It is the epitome of luxury, from the packaging to the look of it on the eyes, because the formula, the texture, the wet glossiness, the dimensional sparkle, all of it, because it's all so perfectly dialed in. This ends up being one of those eyeshadow products that ruins other cream eyeshadows for you. You know what I mean? As always, if you guys are finding all of the demos of every single one of these products helpful, the swatches, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up. That way I know, and that I will keep doing that for you guys. Another shadow that I thought would be a good mention is this cream shadow from Lorac. So this is the shade Lace, and I have, yeah, these kind of crumble in the pot a little bit. It doesn't affect the formula. Personally, I don't really find that it's a big deal, but again, something to just keep a note of. But I wanted to mention this shade in particular also because I've tried other shades from the Lorac cream shadows, and this is the most wet look out of all of them. I wanted to mention the shade Lace because I think that this is such a perfect everyday wet looking eyeshadow. So there are a few of you that have asked for a wet looking eyeshadow that doesn't have a ton of glitter particles to it, and I think that this is a really good option for those of you that want that really pretty everyday kind of subtle glossy effect. This one is very smooth, and it just has a gorgeous shift to it that again doesn't immediately read as super sparkly on the eyes. Has a pretty kind of champagne base to it. So though this isn't the most wet looking eyeshadow that we're talking about today, it's still pretty. I think it's really about how the color, the sparkle, the formula, how all of these things play in together that creates that formula that you end up really liking. Now, next up, we're going to talk about 3 eyeshadows that are all very wet looking, that are all pretty similar. And I thought that these shadows are probably something that you guys have had on your radar in the past. So I thought it would be helpful to kind of give you a full comparison between all 3. So first of all, I have Space Cowboy here from Urban Decay. This was one of the first eyeshadows, if not the first eyeshadow that I tried that I said, you can get a wet glossy look without the need of gloss. And this product proved that to me. I absolutely adore it. And the reason why it looks really wet and glossy on the eyes is that, there it is. I'm sure I'm giving you other swatches though. It has all of those aspects that we were talking about before. It has an incredibly thin, super smooth texture. It has just enough contrast that makes the reflection and the glitters just pop. And I think it's also really important to note that it's partially because these glitters are so fine and ultra smooth and packed very closely together. That is what kind of gives you that mirror-like reflection. Again, when we were talking about with a very calm lake. I absolutely love it, and it's a product that I will always go back to because it was the original for me. And also, I will say that though this is a powder formula, it does have a nice kind of squishiness to it. I never find that it looks dry on my eyelids, is what I'm trying to say, which is not always the case with powder eyeshadows in me. Ritz from Colourpop is also very similar. This isn't the only wet-looking eyeshadow from the Super Shock line. Both Sailor and Sail Away, Frog, a lot of these shades from Colourpop also can look quite wet on the eyes. Ritz is very very similar to Space Cowboy. I mean, on the hand, it's very difficult to even tell the difference between the two. I honestly don't use the word dupe very lightly, but I would certainly call this a dupe. I will say the only difference that I see is that the Colourpop looks like 10% less wet. And I think it's just because of the size and sparkle of the glitters within the Space Cowboy shade. Like, they just emit a touch more of that wet look, but like a 10% difference here. Both are absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous products, and they work so well to add a wet look to any look that you already have going on. So certainly two formulas I love and enjoy, but I also wanted to talk about this shadow right up here, which is Nabla Water Dream. And this is also one of those kind of cult favorite wet looking eyeshadows that folks have enjoyed for a long time. So again, this has an incredibly smooth texture, and that smoothness really helps you get that wet effect. Again, these all look pretty similar, right? Certainly don't need all three to give you this look. I do think though that this is a good example again, and I kind of already gave you guys this example earlier. Space Cowboy ends up for me looking the most wet because it has just a touch more contrast, and a little bit of contrast for me proves to go a long way. I do think Water Dream is just a little bit less pigmented within the base pigment that I would want. So sometimes it can just appear to be like just sparkle, and like I'm looking for a little bit more contrast again. Water Dream ends up looking just like a straight wet glitter without a base pigment to it at all. So if you're looking for that though, then that's something to keep in mind, that Water Dream will give that to you. But on a whole, I just find that Space Cowboy or Ritz ends up looking wetter on my eyes. Now that I am completely covered in glitter, I also wanted to very quickly mention Solstice from Urban Decay. This is again one of those really pretty duochrome red blue kind of eyeshadows. Will absolutely give you that beautiful wet look. A very thin texture. The formula is quite similar to Space Cowboy, and actually there used to be another shade called Diamond Dog from the Moondust line, and that was also a really beautiful wet looking eyeshadow. But within the Moondust line, all of the formulas are a little bit different. Solstice is absolutely gorgeous because it gives you that touch of that wet duochrome look. So it's not just a metallic duochrome. For me, it ends up giving me even more light reflection, and it ends up looking creamier on my eyes than some other metallics have been able to. So if you want to play around with a fun color, this is also one that you could be interested in. On a similar note, Sydney Grace does have an eyeshadow called My Bond, and it's also a very similar color to Solstice from Urban Decay. I think what gives this a little bit more of that wet effect isn't just the sparkle, it is that this cream shadow is incredibly thin and it has a beautiful texture on the eyes. It doesn't look drying. It really creates a beautiful smooth canvas. So you could even use this as a base for other eyeshadow looks. Very easy to blend, affordable. So this is also another one of those wet looking eyeshadows that I could recommend. Babe is also a really pretty shade, but it just doesn't look quite as wet as this one does. I have a bunch of different shades from that line. So if you guys are interested, I do have a video on a bunch of the Sydney Grace eyeshadows if you would like to see what I think. Next, another favorite and has been a favorite for a long time are the ULTA Bouncy Cream eyeshadows, but I am talking about the shade in specific, Italian Ice. This is the perfect everyday soft wet looking eyeshadow. It has a beautiful soft taupey pink base with a very, again, soft reflection to it that just gives you a little bit of that creamy effect. The actual texture is similar to like the Super Shock shadows from Colourpop. They have a great richness, smooth, putty kind of texture, but I just find that Italian Ice looks really expensive on the eyes. I know a lot of you guys have ended up trying out the Bouncy Cream shadows and have really enjoyed them. So I wanted to make sure to mention this one again. Again, it's not the wettest look that I can achieve, but it is one that I always go back to, and I think it's very soft for an everyday look. And And next up, let's talk about a couple of bodiography glitter pigments. So I actually bought a trio of these. So I have the shade Stellar and Off the Hook. These are the ones that I think look super, super wet, but I've also tried the shade Sparkler. That one is also very pretty, but it's a little bit more of a metallic. But that being said, these are the ones that I'm reaching for when I want that really wet look. They have a beautiful smoothness to them, and they're actually quite pigmented, I would say. Like, you really don't need a lot of this product. The base pigment on these are stronger than something like the ones from Hourglass, but I don't mind that, and I actually think that these shades are really gorgeous. So if you like more of a cool toned kind of look, Off the Hook is probably going to be a better bet for you. You could use this as a topper, you could use it as a one and done, which is typically what I do. And again, it just looks really creamy and pretty on the eyes. It has all of those little twinkles that I think is what makes these kind of products so beautiful and fun to play with. And I also think that Stellar is gorgeous too. This one to me might even look more wet than Off the Hook, but I think it's because the pigment is so concentrated and incredibly smooth. If you're looking for more of a warm toned wet looking eyeshadow, I think that this is also a really good way to go. Another very classic example of a great wet looking eyeshadow are the Natasha Denona Chroma Crystal Top Coats. There are a bunch of different shades. They have some more duochrome shades. Shades I have are peach and gray brown. I absolutely love both of these, and they're beautiful if you really want that ultra glossy wet look. So these do have, again, everything that I'm looking for and checking off when it comes to a wet looking eyeshadow. It has that very soft translucence to it. It has beautiful reflective glitters. The formula itself almost kind of feels wet in a sense too, but they are incredibly smooth once applied to the eyes. Beautiful soft reflection. It almost just looks like your eyes are just a touch dewy. Like, it really does create that pretty dewy effect. It doesn't look like you're trying to get there. It looks like you've already been there. It's natural. So beautiful. And I think that these for me have been a mainstay in my wet looking eyeshadow collection just because they're so dependable to give me that look. And I also like that there isn't a ton of glitter to them. Like, obviously the eye look that I have on today is a lot of wet glitter, and these are nice even for every day as more of a soft shimmering kind of glitter look. Gorgeous. They just make the quality of your skin look good. That's something else that I really like about wet looking eyeshadows. I just feel like it makes the quality of my eyes look better. Like, the skin looks a little bit more radiant. That to me is a contributing factor to why I really gravitate towards this kind of look. And lastly are the Pris-Metal Eye Chrome mousses from Cat. So I have the shade Chrome Crusher and the shade Frosty Foil. I think Frosty Foil is less wet looking, more of like a flaky, flecked kind of sparkle topper. Still pretty, but I don't think as wet looking necessarily. Kind of in the same boat with like the toppers within the Roen eye palettes. Like, they do look wet as a whole, but kind of up close, they're more of a texture kind of product. Chrome Crusher, on the other hand though, if you go in with a light hand, this will give you a beautiful, creamy, glossy, wet effect on your eyes. I will say that when I've built this up, it leans more metallic. So I think less is more with this. And I do think if you are looking for wet looking eyeshadows in your collection, maybe try going for one of your more metallic eyeshadows, but just really, really shearing it out onto the eyes, using like half as much as you would typically do. And I do think that that can help you get there. Having your lids kind of peek through, I think, is helpful in that. But this also has an incredibly beautiful moussey texture, and that also creates such a beautiful smooth reflection as well. All right, and I think that's it. I think those are all of my favorite wet looking eyeshadows. So if you guys have any questions about any of these products, please let me know. I will leave everything linked down below for you guys. Thank you guys as always for watching, and I will see you in my next one.